Hello everyone, and welcome to The History of the Fourth Era. Episode 4, The Cogs of the Imperial Machine. My name is Zach, and I'll be your host as we explore the political and cultural atmosphere of Tamriel in the years following the Oblivion Crisis, leading up to the events of Skyrim. With me is a suite of other writers and thinkers who have helped shape this narrative and our philosophy of how to approach these topics. Each episode will explore the provinces and their happenings, starting from the aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis and moving forwards. Last episode, we wrapped up our tour of Tamriel as we looked out to the provinces to see how they fared during the Oblivion Crisis. If I had to give it an overall grade, we're definitely looking at a near failing. Technically, the Empire didn't fall during this time, but it wasn't looking good by any means. You could point to the north and be like, what are you talking about, Zach? Skyrim and High Rock look all right. Hammerfell's hanging on. Yeah, but that's kind of not the point. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and the links in the south were looking pretty disastrous. This is the responsibility of an empire. Whether you come at it from an altruistic perspective that this is a government's obligation to serve its citizens, or just from the pragmatic perspective that ruling should have more benefits than costs, how one province is faring will impact them all. It's easy to look at a map, see all of the imperial forts, and say to yourself, dang, the Empire's got a strong hold on Tamriel. But that's until you go down to the ground level and see its tenuous grasp on Black Marsh, Elswire, Valenwood, and even Morrowind and Alinor in more political spheres. But it's hard to separate out the Empire, how it genuinely screwed up on, and what happens because of a literal global apocalypse. Today, we're going to take a closer look at the cogs of the Imperial Machine and try to judge for ourselves how it fared. It's a story that has its roots in the founding of the Empire itself, as well as the time before its existence. The core government of the Septim dynasty was, in many ways, a continuation of the Remans long before them. The military, on the other hand, was an institution in a constant state of flux. This clash between the entrenched aristocracy and the legions is an issue in and of itself, which would warrant an entire podcast series. But we'll try to summarize these points with a forward-looking mindset. What we'll see by the end of this episode is hopefully a more fair judgment for the Empire. How were they doing up before the Oblivion Crisis? Alright. It certainly did its part in neglecting some of the provinces, but some of these areas had never been under a tangible degree of human control. It's probably more of a miracle that imperial control even lasted as long as it did in these territories. So, let's get into the nitty-gritty of imperial rule and see what they did right and what they did wrong. So, for starters, how did the Third Empire even work? When you have autocratic regimes like this, the answer is there is no one single answer. We have a general framework of both the Emperor and the Council working to legislate and govern, but how the cogs work under imperial rule differs depending on the Emperor. You have leaders like Empress Morahatha who were very proactive in the affairs of the Empire, despite the rampant corruption and nepotism that plagued the Council. And then conversely, you have an emperor like Antiochus whose lifestyle of debauchery and party left him pretty apathetic to governing. What good we do know about his reign should actually be attributed to the council. You then have situations where both the emperor and the council are strong governing bodies, but they butt heads over who gets the final say. Sometimes the council wins, as was the case of Uriel IV, or the emperor bends the council to their will, as was the case with Uriel V. Long story short, they're both capable of exercising authority, but who has more power depends on the people in charge. Beyond the really big decisions, it was almost always the council, though, that was in charge of the day-to-day operations of the Empire. It comprised 30 members who in turn governed a diocese, appointing prefects to handle the more direct matters. The councilors were regularly in contact with their constituents and their peers, and they met to discuss legislation for the empire as a whole. How the diocese operated, however, is much more variable. In the northern provinces, each district had an assembly, which for Tamrielic standards was pretty egalitarian. In Alinor and Morrowind, the dioceses were under the tight control of the aristocracy. And in Valenwood, Elswire, and Blackmarsh, the dioceses were, in practice, non-existent, but not for a lack of trying. The early empire did see legislative bodies in these areas, akin to those in the north, but they just quickly became useless. There's no purpose to having them if no one listens to it anyways. By the time of the Oblivion Crisis, the councilors simply negotiated with whatever factions were in power and executed imperial authority in the garrisons without input from the locals. Harsh, but the Bosmer, Khajiit, and Argonians never really cared what happens inside the garrisons so long as it didn't impact them. What this also means, however, is that there was poor representation for the Khajiit, Argonians, and Bosmer on the Elder Council. What little political power these provinces could potentially wield is mostly assigned to human councilors. The Elder Council overall struggled to be a positive asset for the provinces. The issue of corruption is honestly unavoidable in most cases. Tamriel is a pretty unequal continent, and it should come as no surprise that people in power sometimes use said power to further their own agendas. This is a gigantic issue that we'll start seeing once our narrative begins next episode. Hard times don't inspire some people to act for the common good, but rather for their own interests. Even before the hard times, much of the Elder Council was simply a tool for advancing the financial interests of the powerful aristocracy, even if the councilor themselves weren't technically part of it. The nature of the empire as a prevailing cultural force across Tamriel also means that the most well-intentioned counselors could be seen as traitors to their people. As we'll see in future episodes, there are a handful of smart diplomatic counselors from southern Tamriel which are nearly ousted from power because of their imperial prominence. When the council was a well-functioning political machine, it was still incredibly biased. There are 30 positions on the council, and of those, Cyrodiil holds 9 seats, High Rock holds 5, and Skyrim holds 4. That means that the human nations hold a majority on the council and can dictate its affairs if they so desire. Of course, the human councilors aren't always in agreement with each other, but it's much more likely that their own interests align than with those of the Altmer or Argonians, for instance. Even beyond racial disparities, the fact that the northern provinces are considerably more wealthy than their southern counterparts means that there's a disproportionate amount of power in the north for calling the shots for all of Tamriel. I mean, could we really expect some noblemen in Daggerfall or Solitude to understand the economic or societal needs of Senchal or Falinesti? When Tamriel needs to rebuild itself after the Oblivion Crisis, the Elder Council will try to increase taxes across the board to help rebuild. High Rock, Skyrim, and even Hammerfell could technically afford this, but this was borderline impossible in the south. The dynamics of the council and its inner workings are admittedly dry at times, but I think that it's incredibly important for us to explore this before we start our main narrative. The Third Empire has a history that oscillates between military intervention and bureaucratic supervision, as do all nations, honestly. When the conquest and rebellion ends, the citizens of the provinces more often interact with imperial officials than they do with legionnaires. This interplay between soft and hard power sets the stage for the chaos which will be unleashed when the Oblivion Crisis ends. The hope is that when the system begins to fall apart, that local officials will be able to pick up the slack and make the choices which will stabilize their province and prevent civil strife. Yeah, that's not gonna happen. Whether it's racial tensions, disconnected or corrupt counselors, or just an economic system that doesn't conform to what Cyrodiil and Hierarch envision, the Empire's soft power in Tamriel will begin to crack. It opens the door to power grabs and local revolts, which only further drag the provinces into disorder. It's a snowball effect which will last for years. And this seems like a pretty good segue into the hard power of the Empire, its armies. The natural consequence of civil officials failing to do their jobs is the army coming in to bring order. It's this sort of more tangible action that really causes bigger problems in the provinces. You can complain all you want about extra taxes, but you'll really start to hate the Empire once soldiers kill your friends or family during a riot. The army is indeed capable of making big change in the short term, but this might is right hard power destabilizes everything around it in the long run. How this actually plays out across Tamriel is pretty different. In those places where the Empire has a thin grasp on power, the locals realize that they vastly outnumber the garrisons there. Sometimes this results in open conflict with the legions, but mostly results in widespread chaos that the Empire is simply unable to handle. In the north, the legions become focal points of power. When a commander becomes judge, jury, and executioner in local issues when imperial bureaucracy fades, it's hard to figure out where to draw the line between a government servant and a bona fide warlord. Contrary to what we might think, you could make the case that the North ends up more politically fractured in the immediate aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis than the South. By studying the hard power of the Empire, we can get a better picture of what's to come in the political turmoil which is to come. First and foremost, we should take a tour of the Imperial Legions and what they looked like around the time of the crisis. As of the Third Era, 433, the Empire had 45 legions posted throughout the province. Again, as was the case with the Counselors, the majority of this force was stationed in Cyrodiil, Hierarch, and Skyrim. The legionnaires functioned also as police inside the cities, so several legions were assigned to major settlements like the Imperial City, Daggerfall, and Solitude. The aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis will, overall, see a major reconstruction of the legions. By the end of the Third Era, the Imperial armies were only somewhat different than those in the ages of Tiber Septim. Centuries of being stationed in the distant corners of Tamriel resulted in a variety of arms and armor being deployed by the legionnaires. In the days of Tiber Septim, the standard legion gear consisted of chain armor, a spear, and a short sword with a cylindrically curved shield. It was an outfit that was designed for active battle and conquest, with the durability for combat, but also the flexibility for active marching. Spears were pretty practical for direct battles in tightly packed formations, and the short sword is ideal for stabbing in these packed battlefields. The political environment of the late Third Era no longer warranted this battle-minded gear. By this time, the majority of the Imperial Legion was equipped with lighter armor, comprising leather with additional scale or chain layering. Arms varied considerably, but the short sword remained common, but broadswords and longswords became ever more common, especially in the north. In the south, all legionnaires posted in Valenwood were required to train daily with the bow, and 1 in 3 soldiers in Alinor were required to have a basic knowledge of restoration and destruction magic. Conversely, the Imperial City legions began to don much heavier armor and weapons, akin to those seen by the more conservative officer corps. This change could be seen as early as the mid-2nd century, though, during the reign of Magnus Septim, but this change appears to be largely ceremonial. There is no indication that Magnus was concerned about attacks on the Imperial City, but simply just wanted the legions to look more intimidating. Outside of the Empire's heartlands, these changes were quickly discarded in favor of more pragmatic armor. An interesting exception to this trend is Morrowind, where we see the more traditional arms and armor of the old legions. Why this is the case? Who knows? Military historian Fabius Arcus posits that the restricted garrison life of most legionnaires in Morrowind at that time didn't put as much pressure on having lighter gear all the time. You just kind of hang out base. So overall, there wasn't one standard gear for the Empire. These differences across Tamriel reflected the basic reality that conquest and rule were two entirely different things. The average recruit of the late Third Era had seen drastically less combat than their early Imperial counterparts, and their arms and armor reflected a lifestyle that no longer needed the heavy battle equipment of previous centuries. Even the heavily armored troops of the Imperial City were not donned that way because of actual military circumstance, but was rather just a show of force, more or less a parade uniform. The next thing we're going to talk about is how the Legion fared overall in the Oblivion Crisis. In this series so far, we've heard pretty rough stories about the Legions during this time. At their best, they were kinda disorganized and had small, limited victories against the Daedra. At their worst, they were incompetent and even negligent and hostile towards the locals. It's hard in hindsight to give the armies the benefit of the doubt, but I think we need to give them a closer look and see their infrastructure and how it was managed up until the events of the crisis. An apocalypse is an easy way to exacerbate the faults of a system, but how many of these faults could have been managed beforehand? First, we should talk about the total fighting power the Legion had before the crisis. We don't have exact numbers, but we can guesstimate based on numbers after the crisis as well as how hard each province was hit. One calculation after the crisis pins the total strength of the Imperial Legion at around 75,000 troops, which is about 36% of the theoretical strength of the army at that time. So either one, the Oblivion Crisis wiped out massive portions of the army, or two, some garrisons were undermanned before the crisis even started. So which is it? Well, a little bit of both. One pressing issue we've briefly talked about before at this point is that of recruitment. Throughout the history of the Empire, the main recruitment incentive was local. During times of stability, it was easier to recruit locally as you didn't have to worry too much about insurrection and everyone wanted to work closer to home. Even in more hostile provinces like Morrowind and Alinor, the legions could still count on local volunteers to a certain extent, although many of these were composed of Imperial colonists. If local recruits weren't plentiful enough, the Empire could pull troops from different provinces. They were encouraged to do so with drastically increased pay, and this gave way to foreign troops in these provinces who often behaved more like mercenaries than peacekeepers. But even with the financial incentives, the Empire struggled to fill its ranks in the depths of Valenwood, Elswire, and Blackmarsh. Perhaps the worst case of this was the land of the Argonians. Imperial reports in the aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis pinned their total strength at barely 2,000 soldiers, so about a sixth of its theoretical manpower. This sounds pretty disastrous, but it's complicated by the fact that their estimated casualties were around 3,000. So for those of you doing the math at home, it means that the legions in Blackmarsh were barely at 40% strength before the crisis even started. In fact, this is what we see all across southern Tamriel, with the legions in Elswire and Valenwood also only around 50 to 60% total strength. Overall, this is a hard one to grade the Empire on. It was hard to recruit foreign troops to be stationed in climates that were so different than the North, And I bet that they didn't want to have the Legion so undermanned, of course. On the other hand, the reason they had to recruit foreign soldiers was because the locals were so reluctant to join the army. I mean, I personally wouldn't want to be the one working at the Legion recruitment office in Senchal or Lillemoth, but it says something about imperialization in southern Tamriel. Heck, the legions in Blackmarsh were always paranoid about the Argonians rising up against them. The legions in Alinor were in a constant fight with the Altmer aristocracy. It wasn't an easy job. But this is the job of an empire nonetheless. You need to be able to convince your citizens that they should take part in it. So overall, I give the Empire a 7 out of 10 for recruitment. They faced a historically hard task of recruiting non-human soldiers, but they did have a way of circumventing it if it went bad via northern troops. But in the end, they still had ways they could have made it better, specifically trying harder to integrate these provinces in the first place and give them a bigger incentive to join. So, not exactly a stellar performance, but it's good enough. The other thing we should discuss as to how the Legion fared would be its infrastructure and its ability to respond to the crisis. Obviously, the armies couldn't be everywhere at once, but we can judge them on their logistics and strategy when they try to move anywhere. In general, a legion would have a main headquarters, but would often have detachments, otherwise known as vexillasons, which would be stationed elsewhere. An interesting example would be the legions of Morrowind. The 22nd Legion, otherwise the Buckmoth, had troops stationed in the outskirts of Aldrun, but its main headquarters was Blacklight. Same with the Deathshed Legion in Nisus, with their headquarters in Narcissus, and Moonmoth Legion in Balmora, with Mournhold. It was usually a 60-40 split between the headquarters and the Vardenfell garrison, and this was actually an exception for the Imperial Legions, as most headquarters would house upwards of 80% of the total manpower. What this means is that the cities that housed legions usually fared all right during the crisis, and that was a persistent theme across the last 2 episodes. The problem is, Tamriel's a big place, and a lot of that land falls outside of the immediate vicinity of major cities. The Empire had come up with something that, if more properly implemented, could have solved this problem entirely, and that was the Field Armies. So I've mentioned the Field Armies a few times before, but I think it's time I explain what they are. The Field Armies are special, highly mobile legions that originated from the remnants of Uriel V's expeditionary force to Akavir. During the operation, 6 legions were entirely uprooted and sent across the world. While they were gone, new legions had to be created to replace them in their historic garrisons. Of the 6 that went with Uriel V on this mission, 1 was entirely annihilated, and the other 5 took massive losses. They returned from their mission to find that they had been effectively replaced at their stations. Empress Thonica decided, therefore, to give them new stations, which would best suit their experiences and mobility. The Field Armies are unique amongst the Imperial Legions in that a large portion of their force is composed of cavalry units. In times of peace, they patrol large swaths of the Imperial road system. They were the most experienced legionnaires then, as they frequently clashed with bandits and creatures in their travels. In the more chaotic times, they were the first units that could respond to crises. So overall, these units sound pretty awesome, right? Yeah, but here's the catch. Of the Empire's 45 legions, only 5 were Field Armies. The Nibonese, the Colovian, the Hafingar, the Iliac, and the Alakir Field Army. Notice where all 5 of these are? The north. Throughout the Oblivion Crisis, we can see these armies moving throughout their respective provinces, handling smaller issues before they become bigger ones. In the south, the lack of local recruiting exacerbates the problem of logistics. As we saw in Valenwood and Blackmarsh, the legions weren't even able to navigate their way around the province when they needed to. Not only do the field armies end up being more experienced units, but they also know the lay of the land a lot better because of their routine. Given, I don't think horses fare super well in the swamps or thick forests, but local adaptations are still possible. The fact of the matter is that even before the crisis, the North had a tried and true system that, even during times of peace, was still useful for routine scouting and patrolling. Why no one thought of expanding this system beyond those 5 field armies is beyond me. For that, I have to give the Empire a 5 out of 10 on logistics. The field armies were clearly an advantageous system in the north, and it greatly helped repel the Daedra, but the Empire dropped the ball when it came to implementing this in the south. Part of this can be tied up to the difficulties of local recruiting, but this only further highlights the fact that the Empire just really didn't know the terrain of their southern provinces that well, and this would hurt them regardless if an apocalypse happened or not. So yeah, the Empire did pretty meh during the Oblivion Crisis. It was fortunate that it had a deeply entrenched culture in the north that built a vibrant political and military system. In the south, not so much. And that's the problem. The failures of the South during the crisis are multifaceted, but the simplest answer is that history was not in its favor. Its cultural differences made it difficult to fully assimilate and imperialize, meaning that it never had the infrastructure and politics to have a self-sustaining legion presence. Its existence in these territories was always tenuous, and the crisis was honestly just the straw that broke the camel's back. These mishaps in the late Third Era will actually be incredibly important for our narrative in the Fourth Era. They will shape which peoples naturally gravitate towards the imperial system and which peoples will pull away from it. It also shapes the way the Empire views itself and a system of pros and cons with its constituents. Certain emperors will have different opinions about what the Empire should be made of, but others will be much more okay with letting some of the provinces slip away. Conversely, the strong military culture in the north will actually be the biggest problem in the aftermath of the crisis. The field armies are, by far, the best equipped units in the whole of Tamriel for marching over huge swaths of land as they try to keep order, or, as we'll see, take power for themselves. It's nice to have a gigantic army, but only if you can pay them all. If you can't, well, the line between a soldier and a well-equipped bandit gets pretty blurry. So join us next time as our main narrative officially begins. In the aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis, Okato reluctantly accepts the title of Potentate as he tries to find a suitable heir to the throne. Apparently, the Septim dynasty might not be entirely dead, and the Potentate will travel to the depths of High Rock to see if this is the case. Not exactly a first move as a leader, immediately trying to dump the job out on someone else. It's certainly noticed by the Elder Council, who start hatching their own plan to consolidate power. An apocalypse that happened everywhere at once is a recipe for disaster once the relief needs to start. Cities all over Tamriel are devastated, and the populace are enraged that so little help is arriving from the Heartland. Riots are bound to happen, and ambitious politicians can use this chaos to advance their own agendas. The absence of strong imperial authority during the crisis leads to local heroes who will continue the string of victories in the aftermath of apocalypse. Some of them are just petty charlatans looking for a shred of glory and recognition, but others are more cunning and will begin sowing the seeds of nations that will rival the Empire in strength. I'm excited to get further into the details with all of you. For now, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the idea of this podcast, please like and subscribe, and you'll be the first to see when new episodes come out. We also have our official Discord channel now, the Imperial Philomath, and it'll be ready for everyone else by the next episode. Just kind of tweaking things here and there and making sure it's all good to go. You can be the first to chat with our writers about the channel's developments, talk shop about lore and other nerdy stuff, or join the project as a writer or artist. For now, have a great rest of your day. Our intro song is Jeremy Soule's King and Country from the Oblivion soundtrack, and our outro is Around the Fire from the Skyrim track. Links are available in the description below.